A billionaire CEO walked onto a construction site and told a single father she needed a husband by morning. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. The morning started the way most of Ethan Ryder's mornings started. Badly. His alarm went off at 5:15, same as always, and he lay there for exactly 30 seconds staring at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed before his brain remembered everything he had to do that day. There was the Whitmore job on Rutledge Avenue, which was 3 days behind schedule because the subcontractor who was supposed to deliver the reclaimed heart pine flooring had called on Wednesday with some story about a warehouse flood that Ethan didn't fully believe. There was also the estimate he owed the Preservation Society by noon, a stack of invoices he hadn't touched since Monday, and the small but increasingly urgent fact that his daughter had eaten the last of the cereal the night before and he'd forgotten to buy more. He sat up, rubbed his face, listened. Down the hall, he could already hear Lily moving around. The particular sound of a 7-year-old who had decided she was fully awake and therefore the rest of the house should be too. Drawers opening, feet on hardwood, the soft thud of something falling, and then a moment of silence that meant she was deciding whether it was worth telling him about. "Dad?" she called. "I'm up," he said, even though he wasn't yet standing. "We don't have any cereal." "I know." "Or milk." "I know that too." A pause. "So what are we having?" Ethan finally swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Toast," he called back. "Get dressed first." He heard her groan in a way that was so theatrically disappointed he almost smiled. That was the thing about Lily. Even at 7, she had a particular gift for making her feelings known without ever being cruel about it. She'd gotten that from her mother, probably. The ability to express disappointment in a way that somehow didn't feel like an attack. Caroline had been good at that. Ethan had never quite figured out how to do it himself. He tended to go quiet instead, to hold things in until they either resolved themselves or came out sideways at the wrong moment. It was a flaw he was aware of and hadn't done much about. He got dressed in the dark. Jeans, work boots, a faded gray thermal he'd owned for 4 years, and went downstairs to make the toast. By 7:30, Lily was at school and Ethan was on Rutledge Avenue with coffee from the gas station 2 blocks over, standing in the middle of what used to be the ground floor of a 19th century single house that Ryder Restoration had been hired to bring back to life. The building had good bones. That was always the first thing Ethan looked at, the bones. The bones on this one were exceptional. Original wide plank subflooring under 3 layers of subsequent renovation, plaster medallions on the parlor ceiling that someone in the 1970s had painted over 3 times, and a staircase with hand-turned balusters that some contractor in the 1990s had apparently decided to just drywall around instead of dealing with. Ethan's crew had spent the better part of 2 weeks carefully undoing that particular decision, and the staircase that had emerged from behind the drywall was genuinely beautiful. That was what he loved about this work. Not the money, which was inconsistent at best. Not the administrative side, which he was mediocre at and knew it. What he loved was the process of finding out what something used to be and returning it to that. There was a satisfaction in it that was hard to explain to people who hadn't felt it. The moment when you pulled back a layer of bad decision-making and found something worth saving underneath. His foreman, a broad-shouldered 40-something named Marcus Webb, was already briefing the crew when Ethan arrived. Marcus had been with him for 6 years, since before Lily was born, and ran the job site with a calm authority that Ethan had come to depend on more than he usually admitted. "Flooring guy called again," Marcus said, falling into step beside him as Ethan walked the perimeter. "Said Friday now." "He said Wednesday on Monday." "Yep. And now it's Friday." "That's what he said." Ethan stopped walking. He looked at the section of subfloor they'd been waiting on, a roughly 400-square-foot expanse that couldn't be finished until the heart pine arrived. "Get me his number. I'll call him myself." Marcus handed over his phone without comment. He'd heard that tone before. Ethan made the call. It took 6 minutes and was not a particularly pleasant conversation, But by the end of it, the flooring was arriving Thursday morning, and the contractor on the other end had understood that Ethan was not a man who responded well to being strung along. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice on the phone, but he had a way of being direct that people tended to take seriously. He handed Marcus's phone back. Thursday. Better, Marcus said, and went back to his crew. The morning moved the way mornings on job sites moved, fast in some stretches, frustratingly slow in others. Ethan spent 2 hours working alongside his guys on the plaster restoration in the upstairs parlor, which was painstaking and satisfying in equal measure. Then another hour on the phone with the Preservation Society about the estimate, which required him to explain 3 times that authentic lime-based plaster costs more than synthetic alternatives because it was a fundamentally different material and not just a preference. By 11 o'clock, he was eating half a sandwich he'd brought from home, standing at a folding table covered in blueprints, and the morning felt like it was going reasonably well. That was when the black car pulled up. It wasn't unusual for a nice car to come by a job site. Clients came to check on progress. Inspectors came in county vehicles. Real estate people sometimes slowed down to look at the work. Ethan registered the car, a dark Mercedes, new, the kind with a quiet engine that you heard by its absence more than its sound, and went back to his sandwich. But the car stopped, parked. And the woman who stepped out of it was not a client, an inspector, or a real estate agent. She was in her early 30s, maybe 30, sharp-featured and composed in the way of someone who had spent years learning to look that way in public. Dark blazer over a silk blouse, dark slacks, heels that were sensible enough for someone who had to move fast, but good enough to cost more than Ethan's monthly truck payment. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a way that was either effortless or the result of considerable effort. He couldn't tell. She surveyed the job site the way someone surveys a room they've walked into with a specific purpose. Her eyes found him immediately, which told him she already knew who he was. She walked toward him without hesitation, picking her way across the uneven ground in those heels with a precision that suggested she'd done harder things. She didn't look around at the scaffolding or the stacked lumber or the crew members who were watching her with varying degrees of curiosity. She looked at him. "Ethan Ryder," she said. Not a question. "That's right." She stopped a few feet away from him. Up close, he could see that she was tired underneath the composure. The specific kind of tired that wasn't about sleep, but about carrying something heavy for a long time. Her jaw was set in a way that looked like it was always set that way, like she'd made a decision years ago not to let things show on her face and had mostly succeeded. "My name is Vivian Ashcroft," she said. "I need a husband by tomorrow morning." The job site went quiet. Not completely. There was still the distant sound of someone running a grinder 2 floors up. But the men near enough to have heard it stopped moving in that particular way people stop moving when they've heard something they're not sure they actually heard. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. His sandwich was still in his hand. "Come again?" he said. "I need a husband," she said, with the exact same inflection she'd used the first time, as if repetition would make it clearer. "A legal marriage. It needs to happen before 8 a.m. tomorrow. I realize how that sounds, and I'm not going to apologize for how it sounds because I don't have time to be delicate about it. I need you to hear me out." He stared at her. Then he set his sandwich down on the blueprint table. "Marcus," he said, without looking away from her. "Yep," Marcus said from somewhere behind him. "Give us a minute." He heard the particular sound of Marcus redirecting the crew. Quiet words, boots on concrete, the resumption of work noises from other parts of the building. Then it was just him and Vivian Ashcroft standing 6 feet apart on a construction site in Charleston, and she was waiting for him to say something. "You want to tell me why?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I want to do." She didn't tell it quickly. To her credit, she didn't tell it as if she was selling him something either. No smoothed over edges, no practiced pitch. She told it the way someone tells something when they're exhausted and they need the person in front of them to actually understand it. Ashcroft Heritage was a company her grandfather had built. Not a portfolio company, not a real estate investment trust operating under a heritage-sounding name, an actual legacy. 80 years of deliberate work acquiring and preserving historic properties across the Southeast. 12 properties in South Carolina alone. Hotels, estates, 2 working plantations that had been converted to cultural centers, a collection of pre-Civil War structures in Beaufort that her grandfather had bought out of foreclosure in the 1980s and spent a decade restoring. The company was worth somewhere north of $400 million, depending on who was doing the valuing, and for most of its history, it had been guided by a single principle. You didn't tear things down. Her grandfather had died 8 months ago. He had left controlling interest to Vivian, which should have been straightforward except for a codicil in the original family trust, a provision drafted in the 1960s by a lawyer who had apparently never anticipated a female heir running the company, that required any unmarried female controlling shareholder to have her decisions ratified by the full board until she was either married or had held the position for 2 years without a board challenge. 2 years, Ethan said. He's been challenging every significant decision since month 1, she said. My cousin, Declan Ashcroft. He holds 31%, and he's been very patient about it. What's the board meeting about? Her jaw tightened slightly. There's a developer, National Group, based out of Atlanta. They've been after 2 of our Beaufort properties for 3 years. Declan has been quietly building support for a sale. He needs a majority vote to push it through, and he spent the last 2 months working the board. Thursday's meeting is when he makes his move. And if I'm married, the codicil is void. I have unilateral authority. Declan can bring it to a vote, but he can't force my hand, and he doesn't have enough board support without the codicil leverage. She paused. If I'm not married, he can call for a temporary leadership review under the trust terms, which buys him 3 weeks. 3 weeks is enough time to get the votes he needs. Ethan looked at her for a moment. There's no way to just challenge the codicil legally? Already tried. We filed in February. The trust language is airtight, because the same provision applies to male heirs who are judged incapacitated, and the court doesn't want to open that can of worms. My lawyer says we could win eventually, but not before Thursday. What does eventually mean? 18 months. Maybe more. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the job site around them without really seeing it. And you chose me. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite discomfort, but adjacent to it. I investigated 14 candidates over the past 3 weeks, she said. Men who were single, who didn't have criminal records, who were financially stable enough that the money I'm offering wouldn't make them desperate or unpredictable. How much money? $250,000. Up front. With a full legal agreement protecting you if anything goes wrong. You're not on the hook for anything. Not her debts, not her legal problems, nothing. Ethan absorbed that. It was a significant sum, significant enough that he felt the pull of it, and also, almost simultaneously, the discomfort of feeling that pull. You said you investigated me. What does that mean? It means I know that 3 years ago you turned down a demolition contract worth $68,000 because you didn't agree with tearing down the building. It means I know that when your previous business partner tried to cut corners on a restoration job and asked you to sign off on it, you dissolved the partnership instead. It means I know that your daughter is named Lily, she's in 2nd grade at Meminger Elementary, and you've been raising her alone since her mother died 4 years ago. She held his gaze. It means I spent a significant amount of time and money determining that you are not the kind of man who can be bought or scared off once you've made a decision. I need someone like that standing next to me this week. The job site noise continued around them. Somewhere above, someone was running a drill. The morning was bright and warm, the kind of Charleston spring morning that tricked you into thinking things were simple. You said candidates, Ethan said. Why'd the other 13 fall out? 2 wanted to renegotiate the amount before I'd even finished explaining the situation. 3 had backgrounds that would invite the kind of scrutiny I can't afford right now. 1 agreed, and then I discovered he'd already told someone about it before the ink was dry on the NDA. A brief pause. The rest just didn't feel right. Didn't feel right how? She considered the question more carefully than he expected. I'm going to need someone to live credibly alongside me for the next several months, at minimum, not just sign a piece of paper. Declan is going to come at this marriage with everything he has. My board is going to watch us. Reporters are going to watch us. I need someone who is, she seemed to be choosing the word deliberately, genuine. Someone who doesn't perform well, but who actually is what he appears to be. Most people, when you offer them $250,000, stop being what they actually are. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You think I won't? I think the likelihood is lower with you than with anyone else I found. It wasn't a compliment exactly, more like a calculated assessment delivered without flattery. He found that he respected it more than he would have respected flattery. The properties in Beaufort, he said, the ones the developer wants. 2 antebellum structures on the river. One of them was built in 1847, the other in 1858. Both are on the National Register. The developer wants to demolish both and build a mixed-use residential complex. Something moved across her face. My grandfather bought those properties when I was 9 years old. He took me to see them. I remember standing inside one and he said, she stopped, recalibrated. He spent 30 years and a significant amount of money making sure those buildings would outlast him. I am not going to let them be torn down for condominiums. Ethan looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze without flinching, which he noted. I need to think about it, he said. Something crossed her face, not panic, but the awareness that she was running out of time for anyone to think about anything. She controlled it quickly. How long? A few hours. I need an answer by 4 o'clock. You'll have one. She held out a card. He took it. The card had a number on it and nothing else. No company name, no title, no address. He looked at it for a moment. You do this a lot? He said. Show up at people's job sites and ask them to marry you? It wasn't a particularly good joke, but the corner of her mouth moved just slightly in a way that was so brief he almost missed it. First time, she said, and walked back to her car. He didn't tell Marcus what it was about. He said it was a potential client and that he needed some time, and Marcus gave him the look that meant, I know that's not the whole story, but I'm going to let it go, and went back to supervising the plaster crew. Ethan drove to the waterfront. He sat in his truck and looked at the water for a while. He thought about $250,000. He thought about what that would mean, the equipment he could buy, the larger projects he could take on, the college fund for Lily that currently had about $18,000 in it and was growing slowly. He tried not to let the money be the thing that decided it, because the money wasn't the right reason, and he had a long-standing habit of not making decisions for wrong reasons, even when the wrong reasons were very appealing. He thought about the buildings in Beaufort. He'd seen them, actually, driven past them 2 years ago when he'd gone down for a weekend with Marcus and Marcus's wife. He remembered thinking they were exactly the kind of structures that shouldn't exist anymore, and yet somehow did. The kind of buildings that were full of difficult history and also irreplaceable craftsmanship, and also proof that something had actually happened in a place. He had a complicated feeling about them, the way he had complicated feelings about a lot of old things. They were worth saving. That was what he believed. Not everything old was worth saving, but these were. He thought about Lily. This was the part that was hardest to think about clearly. He would be bringing Lily into something complicated, not directly, but she'd be aware. She was 7, but she was sharp in a way that meant she noticed more than adults usually gave her credit for. If he married some billionaire he'd met that morning and she moved into their house, which was apparently part of what Vivian had described as maintaining credibility, Lily was going to have questions. Lily was going to have a lot of questions. He thought about what he would tell her. He thought about whether there was a version of this he could explain honestly to a 7-year-old. The honest version was, sometimes adults have to make complicated decisions to stop bad people from doing bad things, and the fact that it's complicated doesn't mean it's wrong. He didn't know if that was something a 7-year-old could hold. He thought Lily might be able to. She was better at holding complicated things than most adults he knew. He called his lawyer at 1 o'clock. Her name was Petra Dalton, and she had an office on Broad Street, and she had been his lawyer since before he started the business. And her reaction to what he described was a long silence, followed by, Ethan, what are you involved in? Nothing yet. That's why I'm calling. You want me to review a contract for Another pause. A marital agreement. A legal agreement protecting me from liability and establishing the terms and duration. She says she already has one drafted. I want you to look at it before I sign anything. That's the most reasonable thing you've said in this conversation. He heard typing. Send it over when you have it. Do not sign anything before I see it. Is that clear? Yes. Do you want my personal opinion? Not really. I'm going to give it anyway. This has the potential to get very messy very fast. I know. And you're still considering it. I'm still thinking. Fine, she said, in the tone of a woman who had long accepted that her client sometimes made complicated decisions. Send me the agreement. He called Vivian at 3:15. She picked up on the second ring. I have conditions, he said. A brief pause. Tell me. My lawyer reviews the agreement and has final say on the terms protecting me. If she finds anything she doesn't like, we renegotiate before I sign. That's reasonable. My daughter comes first. Always. Whatever arrangement we make, whatever you need from me in public, if Lily needs me, I leave. No questions, no pushback. Understood. And I want to know what we're telling her. She's 7, not stupid. If you're going to be in my house, she needs some version of the truth, not the business version, a real version. There was a longer pause this time. I hadn't thought that far ahead. You should have. You're right, she said, and he heard something genuine in it. Not defensive, just an acknowledgement of a real gap in her planning. What would you tell her? I'd tell her that you needed help with something important and that I decided to help you, and that you're going to be staying with us for a while. She'll have follow-up questions, but she can handle ambiguity better than most people. Okay. And I'm not moving into your world, he said. I understand there are events and appearances and board meetings and whatever else. I'll do those when I need to. But I'm not leaving my house. I'm not changing the way I work. And I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. I don't want you to pretend to be anything, she said. That's the entire point. He looked out his truck window at nothing in particular. Send the agreement to my lawyer. Her name is Petra Dalton. I'll text you the email address. One more thing, she said, and something in her voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more careful. I know what I'm asking you to do. I know it's not fair. I want you to know that I'm aware of that. He thought about that for a moment. Send the agreement, he said, and hung up. Petra called him at 6:30. Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table and Ethan was making pasta. The simple kind, olive oil and garlic. The kind he made when he didn't have time to think about making dinner. It's cleaner than I expected, Petra said. The liability protections are solid. The duration clause is clear. The agreement terminates automatically in 12 months, unless both parties agree to extend. The financial terms are straightforward. She's clearly got a very good lawyer. But? There's no but exactly. I made 3 amendments and she accepted all 3 inside of 40 minutes, which tells you something about how motivated she is. He heard papers moving. It's an unusual document, but it's a legally sound one. If you sign this and she abides by the terms, you're protected. What are your 3 amendments? A termination clause that lets you exit without penalty if the situation materially changes in ways not covered by the original agreement. A modification to the media clause that limits what she can authorize about you without your explicit written consent. And a provision for Lily's privacy. Nothing about your daughter gets disclosed to press, board, or any other party without your sign-off. He paused his stirring. She agreed to the one about Lily? Immediately. Didn't argue for even 30 seconds. He stood there in his kitchen with the garlic going golden in the pan, and he thought about Vivian Ashcroft standing on his job site with her jaw set and her eyes carrying the weight of something she was determined not to put down. And he thought about 2 buildings on a river in Beaufort that had stood for 170 years and deserved to stand for 170 more. Okay, he said. Okay, meaning you're going to do it. Yeah. Another pause. I want it on record that I think this is one of the more unusual decisions you've ever made. Noted. I also want it on record that the agreement is genuinely fair, and I can see why you'd consider it. Also noted. Be careful, Ethan. I'm always careful. No, you're not, Petra said. But it's nice of you to say so. And she hung up. Pate, he told Lily after dinner while she was sitting on the counter watching him wash dishes, a habit she'd developed around age 5 and never grown out of. He'd tried to explain that the counter was not a seat, and she'd simply looked at him with Caroline's eyes until he'd given up on the point. I need to tell you something, he said. It's a little complicated. She considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to things she decided warranted it. Okay. You know how sometimes people get into situations where they need help, and the way they need help is kind of unusual? Like when you helped Mr. Webb move that one time and it turned into the whole weekend thing. Sort of like that, yeah. He turned off the water and dried his hands. He turned around and leaned against the sink, looking at her. She was watching him with the full attention she gave things when she'd decided they were important, which she'd apparently already decided.
A woman came to the job site today. Her name is Vivian. She's in a situation where she needs someone to help her protect her family's company, and the way she needs help involves getting married quickly. She asked me. Lily was quiet for a moment. You don't know her? I don't. I met her today. So why'd she ask you? She thinks I'm trustworthy. He paused. And because I care about old buildings, and that's what her family's company does, it protects old buildings. Lily thought about this. Her feet swung against the cabinet. So, you're going to marry her? Tomorrow morning, probably, and she's going to need to stay here for a while. In the guest room. A longer pause. What about after? After she doesn't need the help anymore, we go back to the way things were. He looked at her steadily. Unless something changes. But I don't want you to expect something changing, because it might not. Lily thought about this with the careful thoroughness she applied to big things. Does she seem okay? She said finally. Like, is she a good person? He considered the question seriously. I think she's a person carrying a lot of weight who's doing her best with it. I think she's probably good. I'm not certain yet. But you're going to help her anyway. Yeah. Lily looked at the ceiling, which she did when she was processing something. Then she looked back at him. She can have the guest room, she said. But she has to know that Pancake sleeps in the hall sometimes, and he gets scared if people walk past him too fast. Pancake was their cat, a large, somewhat neurotic gray tabby who had come with Caroline's apartment and who had somehow survived the last 4 years with them on personality alone. I'll tell her, Ethan said, and I want to meet her before she just shows up. That's fair. I'll see if she can come by tonight. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied. She hopped down from the counter, picked up her juice glass, and headed for the living room. At the doorway, she stopped. Dad? Yeah. Is she pretty? He thought about Vivian Ashcroft standing on his job site in her dark blazer, tired behind the composure, holding her own with a directness that had no performance in it. She's something, he said. Lily made a sound that might have been a laugh and disappeared around the corner. Modern Sao. Vivian came at 8:30. She came alone, which he appreciated. She'd changed out of the blazer into something slightly less formal, though her version of slightly less formal was still considerably more formal than anyone Ethan usually had in his living room. She stood in his doorway and looked at the house, the modest craftsman bungalow, with the porch that needed repainting and the wind chimes Caroline had hung 8 years ago that Ethan had never taken down, and something moved through her expression that was hard to name. Come in, he said. She came in. She looked at the living room, the books stacked sideways on the overfull shelves, the second-hand sofa covered in the quilted throw Lily had decided 3 years ago was hers, the framed crayon drawings on one wall because Lily had made them, and Ethan had never been able to figure out why something had to be professionally made to belong on a wall. Lily appeared from the hallway in her pajamas, which she was wearing 2 hours before she normally went to bed, which meant she'd put them on specifically for this. She stopped and looked at Vivian with the frank, steady assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned that staring was impolite, or had learned it and was choosing to set it aside for the occasion. Vivian looked back at her with equal steadiness. You must be Lily. Your shoes are very tall, Lily said. Vivian looked down at them. They are, she agreed. Do they hurt? Sometimes, Vivian said. Not tonight. Lily seemed to accept this as sufficient information. Do you know about our cat? Your dad mentioned a cat. His name is Pancake, and he gets scared sometimes. I'll be careful around him. Lily nodded. Then she looked at Ethan with an expression he couldn't fully decode, something that was part assessment, part question, part something he didn't have a word for, and said, She seems okay, very matter-of-factly, and went back down the hall to her room. Ethan looked at Vivian. She was watching the hallway where Lily had disappeared with an expression he hadn't seen on her face yet. Unguarded, a little undone, as if she'd braced for something harder than a small girl in pajamas evaluating her honestly and deciding she was acceptable. "Sorry," he said. "She's direct." "Don't apologize," Vivian said quietly. "She's exactly right to be." They sat at his kitchen table for another hour going through the logistics. She walked him through the marriage license process. South Carolina had a waiting period that she'd already consulted a lawyer about, and there were provisions for expedited processing under specific circumstances that her legal team had arranged. The ceremony would be performed by a judge who owed her family a favor. Not a corruption-adjacent favor, she was careful to clarify, a genuine personal favor from 2 decades back. They would sign the papers at 7 in the morning. "Thursday's board meeting is at 10, she said. "I need documentation in hand by 9:30. "What do you need from me at the meeting?" "To be present, that's all. You don't have to speak or understand the proceedings. Your presence says what it needs to say." "And afterward?" "The credibility period. Probably 3 to 4 months where we maintain appearances convincingly enough that Declan can't mount a fraud challenge. My legal team thinks 6 months is safe." "And after 6 months?" She met his eyes. "The agreement terminates. We make whatever joint statement seems appropriate. You take the money and go back to your life." He nodded. She nodded. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in a house he'd bought with Caroline 10 years ago, and there was something almost absurd about the moment. The specificity of what they were about to do, the neatness of how it had been arranged, the gap between the contract cleanliness of the plan and the messy reality of 2 people who had met 8 hours ago agreeing to be married in the morning. "Are you scared?" he said. He wasn't sure why he asked it. She looked at him for a moment. The composure was still there, but there was something underneath it that she let him see briefly, the way you might open a window just enough to let in some air. "Yes," she said. "I've been scared for 8 months. I just don't let it stop me." He looked at her. Then he held out his hand across the table. She looked at it for a moment as if she was deciding something. Then she shook it. Her grip was firm and her hand was cold, and neither of them said anything else. Outside, the night was quiet over Charleston, and somewhere down the hall, Pancake padded softly through the dark. The next morning, Ethan Ryder and Vivian Ashcroft were married at 7:04 a.m. in the cramped office of a family court judge who smelled like coffee and read the abbreviated civil service with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this several thousand times and was not going to pretend otherwise. Marcus was there as a witness because Ethan had called him at 10 the previous night and said, "I need a favor, and I need you to not ask questions yet." And Marcus had said okay without hesitation, which was why they had been friends for 12 years. Vivian's lawyer was there as the other witness, a woman named Sandra, who had the particular expression of a legal professional who had seen stranger things and was professionally obligated not to say so. There were no flowers, there was no music. There, Lily was at school, which was where she needed to be, and Ethan had kissed her on the forehead that morning and told her he'd see her at 3:15, and she'd looked at him with those careful eyes and said, "Be good, Dad," which was the thing he always said to her when she left, returned to him with a gravity that was funny and not funny at the same time. When the judge said, "You may kiss the bride," there was a beat of silence. Vivian and Ethan looked at each other. 2 people in a fluorescent-lit municipal office who had met 24 hours ago. And then he leaned in and she turned her face slightly and he kissed her cheek, brief and formal, and she accepted it with a composure that didn't quite cover the slight tension in her jaw. "Congratulations," Marcus said dryly, from his chair against the wall, and Ethan gave him a look that promised a longer conversation later. Outside the courthouse, in the early morning light with the Charleston streets just starting to come awake, Vivian stood beside him on the steps and looked at the documents in her hand. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without decoration. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't met Pancake properly." She looked at him, and that brief, almost not a smile moved across her face again. Then she straightened up, squared her shoulders, and pulled out her phone. She had a board meeting to get to. And Ethan Ryder, single father, restoration contractor, and as of 7:04 that morning, husband to a billionaire he barely knew, had a floor delivery to supervise. He drove back to Rutledge Avenue. He put on his thermal and his work boots, and he went back to the old house that was slowly, carefully becoming what it used to be. His hands still knew exactly what to do. The board meeting was at 10 o'clock on the 4th floor of the Ashcroft Heritage Building on Meeting Street, and Ethan sat in a chair that cost more than his refrigerator and tried not to look like a man who had been married for approximately 2 hours and 50 minutes. He'd gone home after the courthouse, changed into the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray one he'd bought for a funeral 3 years ago and worn twice since, and driven himself to the address Vivian's assistant had texted him. He'd found a parking spot 4 blocks away because the building had a private garage, but nobody had told him the code, which felt like an accurate metaphor for the morning. He arrived 7 minutes early, which was his habit, and sat in a lobby that had 17-foot ceilings and original plasterwork that he spent a few minutes examining because it was genuinely impressive, and also because he needed something to look at that wasn't the receptionist, who had clearly been told to expect him and was trying too hard not to stare. Vivian appeared at 9:40. She'd changed too, into something sharper, more formal, the full armor of a person who had a war to walk into. She crossed the lobby toward him and he stood, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the way of two people recalibrating to a new reality. "How are you doing?" she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. "Fine. You?" "Ask me at noon." She looked him over briefly, the suit, the boots he'd switched out for actual dress shoes, the fact that he'd shaved. Something in her expression settled slightly. "You look... Thank you for coming." "Wasn't going to not come," he said. She nodded once, and then her assistant appeared at her shoulder with a tablet and a low-voiced update about someone named Gerald being already in the conference room, and Vivian's face shifted back into the set expression he was beginning to recognize as her working face, and she said, "We're going up," and that was that. The elevator opened onto a conference room with a long table, and Ethan counted 9 people already seated when they walked in. He didn't know most of their names yet. He recognized the type, older money and newer money, arranged in the careful social geometry of people who were polite to each other because the alternative was expensive. They looked at Vivian when she entered. Then they looked at him, and there was a half-second recalibration across most of the faces in the room as they processed the information. And then there was the man at the far end of the table. Declan Ashcroft was 41 and looked like someone who had spent his whole life being the second most important person in every room and had become very good at hiding how much he hated it. He was handsome in a polished way, the kind of handsome that required maintenance, and he was dressed considerably better than anyone else at the table. He had his grandfather's jaw and none of his grandfather's apparent decency, based on everything Vivian had told him. When Declan saw Ethan, something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the recalculation of a man who had laid a careful trap and arrived to spring it and found that someone had already been there. He recovered fast, but not quite fast enough. "Vivian," he said. His voice was smooth and managed. "I see you brought someone." "My husband," she said, with a lightness that was precisely calibrated. She sat down and Ethan sat beside her, and around the table people were murmuring, and one woman near the middle was already looking at her phone in a way that suggested she was pulling up information. Vivian's lawyer, Sandra, was seated to her left and had the documentation ready. She slid a copy toward the center of the table without commentary. Nobody at a board table ever needed to be told to look at a document that had just appeared. "The marriage was performed this morning," Sandra said. "Judge Harris. Fully legal, fully documented, effective immediately." The room was quiet in the particular way of people doing fast calculations. Declan looked at the document. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Vivian. Whatever he was feeling, he had the discipline to keep it at a controlled distance from his face. "Congratulations," he said, and the word had nothing in it. "Thank you," Vivian said, and that had nothing in it either, and the meeting proceeded. Ethan sat through 2 hours of discussions he mostly followed, and occasionally didn't, about property valuations and preservation agreements and a conservation easement proposal that Sandra had apparently filed the previous week that tied up the Beaufort properties legally, regardless of ownership decisions for the next 25 years. A move that Vivian had apparently been preparing for weeks, and that Declan had clearly not anticipated based on the way a muscle in his jaw worked when Sandra explained it. Ethan didn't speak. He sat with his hands folded on the table and watched, and occasionally he was aware of eyes moving to him and away, taking measure. He wasn't comfortable. He wasn't trying to look comfortable. He was just there, which was the only thing he'd been asked to be. And he understood enough about these situations to know that sometimes presence was its own statement. When the meeting ended, Declan was the first one out of the room. He left without looking at either of them, which told Ethan more than any expression would have. In the elevator going down, it was just the two of them for 30 seconds, and Vivian leaned back against the wall and let out a breath that was the most unguarded thing he'd seen her do. He wasn't expecting the easement, Ethan said. No. Smart move. I've been preparing it for 6 months. I just needed to survive long enough to file it. She looked at the elevator doors. We bought about 4 months, I think. Maybe 5. Before he finds another angle. What's the next angle? Fraud, she said. He'll go after the marriage, try to prove it's not real. She straightened up as the elevator opened. Which is why I need to ask you something I should have asked yesterday. They stepped into the lobby. She stopped walking. What? He said. I need to move into your house this week. He looked at her. I know, she said. I know. It's a significant imposition, and I'm aware of that. But Declan has the resources to surveil a separate residence, and if we're living apart, there's no credibility. You figured this was always part of it? Yes. She met his eyes without apology. I didn't lead with it because I needed you to agree to the marriage first. I should have been more direct. Yeah, he said. You should have. She waited. He looked at her and thought about his house. The small second bedroom, the narrow hallway, the bathroom situation that was already complicated with a 7-year-old. He thought about what it would mean to have this woman in that space, this woman who wore $1,000 shoes and had just strategically outmaneuvered a man with 31% of a $400 million company. Fine, he said, but we need to set some ground rules. Whatever you need. Tonight. Come tonight, and we'll talk through them. She nodded. She looked like she was about to say something else, but her phone went off, and she looked at the screen, and the working face came back. I have to go, he said. I know. He walked 4 blocks back to his truck and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. Then he drove to Meminger Elementary to pick up his daughter. Lily took the news that Vivian was moving in with the same deliberate, slightly unsettling calm she applied to most major developments. She asked if Vivian would be eating dinner with them, and when Ethan said probably yes, she asked whether Vivian was a picky eater. And when Ethan said he didn't know yet, Lily said, "We should find out," in the tone of someone adding an item to a logistical checklist. You're handling this pretty well, Ethan said, watching her in the rearview mirror. You said she was trying to save old buildings, Lily said. That's a good reason. He didn't say anything. Also, Lily added, Mrs. Patterson at school got married last year and her husband moved in and she said it was an adjustment. Mrs. Patterson told you that. She said it to Ms. Rowan. I heard. Ethan made a mental note about what conversations happen near 7-year-olds. This situation's a little different from Mrs. Patterson's. I know, Dad. She looked out the window. Is she going to be sad in our house? The question caught him off guard, the way her questions sometimes did, going directly to the thing he hadn't quite let himself think about. Why would she be sad? Because she's away from her stuff. I get sad when I'm at Grandma's too long. He was quiet for a moment. Maybe. I think she's mostly just worried. We could be nice to her, Lily said. That usually helps when someone's worried. Yeah, he said. It usually does. Vivian arrived at 7 o'clock with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, and very little of the fanfare one might have expected from a woman of her resources. She stood on his porch, and he took one of the suitcases, and she didn't protest, which felt like the beginning of a workable arrangement. She took the guest room. It was small and had a full-size bed and a window that looked out on the side yard and a dresser that Ethan had inherited from his grandmother, and he watched her take it in without expression and appreciated that she didn't say anything politic about it. Bathroom's across the hall, he said. Lily's room is the one with the purple doorknob. Her addition, not mine. There's a second shelf in the bathroom cabinet if you need it. The hot water takes about 45 seconds to get there. Okay. And the cat, Pancake,
she said. I remember. As if on cue, Pancake appeared in the doorway of the guest room and sat down and looked at Vivian with the profound judgment of a cat encountering a new person and deciding they were probably fine, but that this opinion remained subject to revision. Vivian looked at Pancake. Then she crouched down slowly and held out one hand. Pancake sniffed it, considered, then turned around and walked away. That's actually good, Ethan said. He hissed at Marcus for the first 3 months. Something at the corner of her mouth shifted. I'll take it. They sat at the kitchen table again. It was becoming their place, he noticed, the place where they were most straightforwardly themselves, and went through the ground rules. He didn't have many. The house was small, and the arrangement was temporary, and most of the rules were just logistics. He asked her about her schedule, what time she left in the morning, whether she needed quiet for early calls. She asked about Lily's routine, whether there were things he needed her to stay out of. There was a practicality to the conversation that felt somehow more intimate than the wedding had. One thing, he said at the end of it. What? Lily is going to want to talk to you. Not just coexist. She engages with people. I don't want you to feel like you have to manage her. Vivian looked at him. I don't find your daughter something that needs to be managed. That's not what I know what you meant, she said. I'm saying you don't need to worry about it. I can talk to a child. He thought about asking whether she had much experience with children, but something in her face suggested that was a more loaded question than it looked, and he let it go. Okay, he said. Towels are in the hall closet. Ethan? He stopped. Thank you, she said. For the room, for all of it. He looked at her. She was sitting at his kitchen table in his house where she hadn't been 2 days ago, and she was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been holding a position under siege for a long time, and she was thanking him with a simplicity that was nothing like what he would have expected from a billionaire CEO. Get some sleep, he said. You probably need it. She did something then that surprised him. She laughed, a small, brief, genuine laugh, the kind that gets out before you've decided to let it. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in about 2 months, she said. He went to bed thinking about that laugh for longer than he probably should have. The thing about sharing a small house with someone was that there was no way to maintain a managed presentation. You saw each other before coffee. You heard each other through walls. You navigated around each other in a kitchen that was designed for one person to cook in comfortably. And you learned very quickly what someone was actually like when they had no audience. What Vivian was like, it turned out, was this. She woke early, before 6, and she worked in silence at the kitchen table for the first hour of every morning. And she drank her coffee black, and she held the mug with both hands. She was meticulous about her physical space, not in a controlling way, just in the way of someone who had lived alone for years and had particular habits. She did her own dishes, every time, before she'd even been asked. She left the bathroom exactly as she'd found it, which was more than Ethan could say for himself some mornings. She also, he noticed, had a way of being very still when she was thinking. Not checked out, engaged, actually more engaged than most people looked when they were animated. Just still. He'd catch her sitting at the kitchen table after Lily had gone to school, staring at nothing, holding her coffee, and the stillness on her had the quality of someone listening to something the room couldn't hear. She worked long hours and said little about what she was working on, which he respected. He worked long hours himself and said little about the details, and they had developed an unspoken agreement that neither of them needed to narrate their professional lives to the other. But occasionally she'd be on a call at the table when he came in, and he'd catch fragments, her voice different on the phone, harder, more stripped down, and he'd file it away without thinking much about it. On Thursday evening, 4 days into the arrangement, she came home at 7:30 looking like she'd been in a fight. Not a physical one. The other kind. The kind where everything is conducted in meeting rooms and memo chains and people say completely civil things while trying to take everything you have. Lily was at the table doing a worksheet about fractions when Vivian came in, and Lily looked up at her and apparently read something in her face. Dad made the pasta again, Lily said. There's some left. You should eat. Vivian stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Lily.
Something in her face shifted slightly, in the way Ethan had started to recognize as the thing that happened to her when Lily said something that landed harder than she'd expected. "Thank you," she said. "Fractions are hard," Lily said by way of general commentary, and went back to her worksheet. Vivian sat down. Ethan put a bowl of pasta in front of her without being asked, and she ate it without seeming to notice she was eating, and after a while the rigid line of her shoulders came down slightly. "What happened?" he said. She glanced at Lily. He understood, and they waited. When Lily finished her worksheet and went to get ready for bed, Vivian turned her coffee cup in her hands and said, "Declan got to 2 of the board members I thought were solid, presented them with something. I don't know what yet. They've called a special session." "When?" 2 weeks. "Can he hurt you at a special session?" "He can make noise. He can—" She stopped. "He found a photo from a charity event 8 years ago. I'm in it with someone who was later convicted of securities fraud. I barely knew the man. I spoke to him for 4 minutes at this event, but Declan is going to use it to suggest that my judgment around financial partners is questionable. It's nothing. Legally, it's nothing. But it's the kind of nothing that makes people nervous." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And nervous board members vote conservatively." "Exactly." He thought about it. "What do you need before the special session?" "To look unimpeachable. The marriage helps. If our life looks—" She seemed slightly uncomfortable with the word she was reaching for. "Real. Normal. If there's no crack for him to get into." "How do you make it look real?" "We make appearances. Together. Not staged, actual appearances. Your industry has an event in 2 weeks, doesn't it? The Low Country Preservation Gala." He looked at her. "You looked that up." "I look up everything. You know that." He had a complicated feeling about the Low Country Gala. He'd gone twice before, found it half useful and half unbearable. The kind of event where the people who actually did preservation work stood in rooms with the people who funded it, and everyone made polite conversation around a fundamental difference in how they thought about buildings. But he went, because there were real connections to be made there, and because his grandfather had always said you showed up even when you didn't feel like it. "I was already going," he said. "You can come." "Together," she said. "It has to look like—" "I know what it has to look like." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to pretend to be comfortable with something I'm not comfortable with and call it strategy. If we go together, we go as people who are genuinely—" He searched for the right word. "Figuring it out. That's what's real. That's what it actually is." She looked at him for a long moment. "Figuring it out," she said. "Yeah." She turned the coffee cup again. Outside, a car went past. Pancake padded in from the hallway, looked at both of them, and settled himself under the table on top of Ethan's feet in a way that served no one's purpose but his own. "He does that a lot," Ethan said. "I noticed." She looked under the table at the cat. "He was on my feet this morning when I was working." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Pancake sat on you?" "For about 20 minutes. He sat on you our first week. Is that significant?" "Marcus has been coming here for 12 years, Ethan said flatly. "Pancake has never sat on Marcus." A corner of her mouth moved. "Maybe he has good instincts." Ethan looked at her, then he looked at his feet, where Pancake was warmly and unhelpfully settled. "Maybe," he said. On Saturday, Vivian was in the backyard when Ethan came outside with 2 cups of coffee. She was standing at the edge of the small yard looking at the old magnolia in the corner, the one that had been there before Ethan bought the house and would be there long after, and she was just looking at it in the still way she had. "Tree or thinking?" he said. She glanced back. "Both." She took the offered cup. "How old is it?" "The magnolia? I don't know. 100 years maybe. There was one in the front yard of the first building we ever did, me and my old business partner. Bigger than that one. We spent 2 days figuring out how to save it while we rebuilt the foundation." He looked at the tree. He wanted to take it down. I said no. That was probably the beginning of the end of the partnership. Over a tree. Over what the tree represented. Over the question of what you kept and what you threw away. He drank his coffee. "Some people see old things as problems. I see them as evidence." She turned to look at him. "Evidence of what?" "That someone was here, that something happened, that this place has weight. He wasn't sure he was explaining it right. He rarely explained it perfectly, which was why he generally didn't try. Buildings aren't just buildings, they're the decisions people made. Tear them down, you're not just removing a structure. You're saying those decisions didn't matter. She was watching him with an attention that was different from the boardroom attention, softer and more direct at the same time. My grandfather said something like that, she said quietly. He said a building that lasts long enough becomes a kind of memory, the city's memory. That's exactly it, Ethan said. She looked back at the magnolia. He would have liked you, she said. It wasn't a flattery. It was a statement of fact delivered with a simplicity that made it feel like something else entirely. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, and they stood side by side in his small backyard with their coffee while the morning came fully awake around them. And it wasn't a comfortable silence exactly, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one either. It was the beginning of something. He didn't name what it was. He was a man who'd learned to be careful about naming things before he understood them. But he noticed it. 2 weeks later, they walked into the Low Country Preservation Gala together, and Ethan watched the room register Vivian Ashcroft, arriving with a man in a charcoal suit who worked with his hands for a living, and he felt the particular awareness of being looked at and assessed, and he stood there anyway. Vivian moved through the room the way she moved through every room, with purpose, making every interaction look chosen rather than obligated. But she stayed close to him in a way she hadn't on any of their previous public outings. And twice during the evening, she rested her hand briefly on his arm in a gesture that was understated enough to be real and legible enough to be seen. And each time he felt the warmth of it before he thought about the strategy of it. Halfway through the evening, a woman named Ruth Gaines, 60 years old, lifelong preservation advocate, the kind of person whose approval actually meant something in this room, cornered Ethan near the silent auction table. "You're Ryder Restoration," she said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am." "You did the Whitmore house." "Still doing it. We're about 2 weeks out from completion." She looked him over. Then she looked at Vivian, who was across the room talking to someone and was not looking at them. "She seems different," Ruth said. "Different how?" "Less alone," Ruth said it plainly, without drama. "She's had a hard 8 months. You probably know that. Her grandfather was... Thomas Ashcroft was one of the finest people I've ever known." She looked back at Ethan. "You're the real thing, aren't you? You're not just..." "No," he said. "I'm not just anything." She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, the way people nod when they've decided something. "Good," she said. "She needs someone who's actually there." He watched Ruth walk away. Across the room, as if she'd felt the moment without seeing it, Vivian glanced over and found him. And for a second it was just that, her finding him in a room, him already there. He looked away first. He picked up a glass from a passing tray and stood by the windows and watched the city lights over the harbor. And he thought about Ruth Gaines saying less alone. And he thought about a woman who kept finding his house more livable than she'd expected and kept being surprised by it. And he thought about a small gray cat who had apparently decided she was worth sitting on. He was not a man who let himself fall into things. He was a man who looked at foundations first, who tested the bones of a structure before he committed to it, who understood that beautiful things could still be structurally unsound. He knew that. He was beginning to understand, not entirely in control of what was happening to him, which was a new and not entirely unwelcome kind of problem to have. The article ran on a Monday. Ethan found out about it the way he found out about most things he hadn't been expecting. From Marcus, who showed up at the Rutledge Avenue job site at 7:15 in the morning, holding his phone out with the particular expression of a man who wants to warn you about something before you see it yourself. The headline was on a local news blog that covered Charleston society and business, the kind of site that lived in the space between legitimate journalism and sustained gossip. It read, "Ashcroft heiress's rushed marriage raises questions about motive. Who is Ethan Ryder?" He read it standing in the middle of the unfinished parlor floor, with the smell of sawdust around him and his coffee going cold in his other hand. The article was 400 words and contained approximately 200 words of verifiable fact, 100 words of speculation dressed up as analysis, and another 100 words of quotes from an unnamed source described only as someone close to the Ashcroft board. The unnamed source suggested that the marriage had been, in their words, strategically timed to circumvent legitimate governance questions about Ms. Ashcroft's leadership capacity. There was a photo. It was from the Low Country Gala. Him and Vivian standing near the windows, not touching, not looking at each other in that particular moment. The photo had been cropped in such a way as to make them look like two people at the same party rather than two people together, which was, he understood, exactly the point. He handed Marcus's phone back without saying anything. "You want to talk about it?" Marcus said. "Not right now." "Okay." Marcus paused. "For what it's worth, my wife saw it this morning, and her exact words were, and I'm quoting, 'That reporter doesn't know what he's talking about. She's met you twice. She likes Vivian.'" "Your wife met Vivian?" "At my daughter's birthday thing last weekend. You brought her, remember? She and Keisha talked for about 40 minutes about historic tile work, of all things." Marcus looked at him steadily. "Keisha doesn't talk to people for 40 minutes unless she decides they're worth it." Ethan didn't respond to that. He called Vivian. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd already seen it. "I know," she said, before he could speak. "Where did the photo come from?" "Someone at the gala. Probably hired. Declan has people who do this kind of thing. Build a narrative slowly, plant seeds, wait for them to grow." Her voice was controlled, but he'd spent 3 weeks now learning the specific frequencies underneath her control, and there was something tight in it. "My PR team is drafting a response." "What kind of response?" "Measured, professional. We don't engage directly with the speculation. We just..." "Vivienne." He waited. "Is that going to work?" A pause. "Probably not by itself." "Then what actually works?" She was quiet for a moment. "Visibility. We need to be seen being what we say we are. More events, more public presence, more..." She stopped. "More what?" "More of what we were at the gala, which I know is asking a lot of you." He thought about what they'd been at the gala. He thought about Ruth Gaines saying less alone. He thought about the drive home, the two of them in his truck, Vivian looking out the passenger window at the city she'd grown up in, saying almost nothing, and the quality of that silence being so different from the silences of the first week. "It's not asking a lot," he said. "I just need to know what we're doing. I'll send you the calendar. There are 3 events in the next 2 weeks." Another pause. "Ethan, I want to say you don't have to." "I want to," she said firmly. "I knew this was coming. I knew Declan would go after the marriage publicly. I should have prepared you for it better." "You prepared me fine. I knew what I signed up for." Knowing something intellectually and having your name in a headline are different things. He looked around the job site. Marcus already directing the crew, the heart pine floors finally going down in the far parlor, the morning light through the unshuttered windows making the old plaster look like something worth saving, which it was. "I'm fine," he said. "Handle your end. I'll handle mine." He hung up. He put the phone in his pocket. He picked up his coffee and drank it cold because it was there, and wasting it seemed like the wrong response to the morning. "Back to work?" Marcus said. "Back to work," Ethan said. But the 3 events over the next 2 weeks were a Chamber of Commerce dinner, a private fundraiser for the Historic District Commission, and a Sunday afternoon reception at one of Ashcroft Heritage's hotel properties, a restored 1890s inn on the Battery that Ethan had driven past 100 times and never been inside. They moved through each one differently. At the chamber dinner, he sat beside her at a table of 10 and listened more than he talked, which was his natural mode in rooms full of people he didn't know, and she moved the conversation around the table with a fluency that he watched with a kind of professional respect. She never let anyone feel left out and never let anyone dominate, and she made it look effortless even though he was beginning to understand it wasn't. At the Historic District fundraiser, he ended up in a 40-minute conversation with 2 architects about lime plaster versus gypsum that was the most genuinely enjoyable conversation he'd had at an event in years. And when he looked up, Vivian was across the room watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately classify. "You were actually having fun," she said in the car after. "I like talking about plaster." I could tell. Something in her voice was warm in a way that wasn't quite professional. "It's good. It's... People noticed." "People noticed me talking about plaster?" People noticed you being real, she said. It reads differently than most of the men who come to those things. He didn't know what to say to that, so he watched the street and let the silence settle. The inn reception was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, but because of what went right. The Ashcroft Heritage Inn on the Battery was exactly what a building looked like when someone with genuine commitment had spent 20 years bringing it back from the edge. Ethan walked through the public rooms and felt it the way he felt all good restoration work. In his chest, a specific kind of satisfaction that was also something like grief, because it reminded him of what buildings could be when people cared enough to do it right. The millwork was original. The plaster cornices had been carefully documented and replicated where they'd been lost. The floors were heart pine, same as what he'd just finished laying on Rutledge Avenue, sanded to a warmth that no synthetic alternative could replicate. He stood in the main parlor and forgot, for a few minutes, that he was there for any reason other than the building. My grandfather restored this one himself, Vivian said, appearing beside him. He was here almost every weekend for 3 years. My grandmother used to complain that the inn saw more of him than she did. She looked at the ceiling medallion above them. He restored that cornice by hand. He was 62 years old, and he was up on a scaffold doing it himself because he didn't trust anyone else to get it right. He sounds like someone I would have liked, Ethan said. She looked at him. Her face in the warm light of the restored parlor was different from her face in boardrooms or at kitchen tables. Softer, more open, the way a house looked with all its windows uncovered. He would have taken you up on that scaffold, she said. He was always looking for someone who actually cared about what they were doing. They stood there together in a room her grandfather had rebuilt with his own hands, and something between them shifted in a way that neither of them named or looked directly at, the way you didn't look directly at something you weren't sure you were ready to see clearly. The fraud allegation came on a Wednesday. Declan filed a formal challenge with the trust administrator. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but the legal equivalent of a flare sent up over a battlefield. The filing claimed that the marriage had been entered into fraudulently, with consideration paid, and that it therefore did not satisfy the codicil requirement. He had, his filing noted, a witness willing to testify that they had overheard a conversation about financial terms between Ethan and Vivian prior to the marriage. Sandra called Vivian at 8 in the morning. Vivian came downstairs 20 minutes later, and Ethan was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and one look at her face told him that the thing they'd known was coming had arrived. She told him the contents of the filing while Lily was at school. When she was done, she stood by the counter with her arms folded, not defensively, just holding herself, and waited for him to react. "Who's the witness?" he said. "We don't know yet. Sandra is working on it." "What do they claim to have heard?" "A conversation about the amount, the $250. She looked at him steadily. "Which is real?" "Which we did discuss. The question is whether discussing financial terms constitutes fraudulent inducement, and Sandra says the answer is legally no, but it gives Declan a story," Ethan said. "Yes." He sat with it. He turned his coffee cup. "Who knew about the money?" "You, me, Sandra, Petra Dalton." She paused. "Marcus was there when I came to the job site, but he was out of earshot for that part of the conversation." "Marcus was out of earshot," Ethan said. "I can say that with certainty." "There's another possibility." Her voice was careful. "My assistant knew I was going to make an offer. She's the one who put together the background research on the candidates. I trusted her completely." A pause. "Or I thought I did." He looked at her. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was holding something that was costing her. "You think it was her?" "I think Declan has resources and patience and has been watching my office for months. I think someone who wanted to help him would have had access to information about my process." She looked away. "She's been with me for 4 years." He didn't say anything because there was nothing particularly useful to say. He'd had a business partner he'd trusted for 3 years turn out to be someone who cut corners when the cost was high enough, and he still remembered the specific quality of that disappointment. Not rage, just a kind of sad reordering of what you'd believed about someone. "What does Sandra need?" he said. "She wants to depose both of us, build the record, establish the timeline of the relationship independently of the financial arrangement." She met his eyes. She's going to ask you detailed questions about our personal interactions, things that would demonstrate a genuine relationship independent of the contract. He thought about that. He thought about pancakes sitting on her feet, about the magnolia in the backyard and the conversation that had happened beside it, about the way she'd looked in the parlor of the Battery Inn, standing in the room her grandfather had built with his own hands, about Lily handing her fractions homework to look at one evening, and Vivian sitting there for 20 minutes genuinely helping, not performing helpfulness, but actually engaged, asking Lily what she found confusing and listening to the answer. "That won't be hard," he said. Something moved through her face. "You don't have to make this easy. I'm not making anything. I'm saying what's true." He held her gaze. "What we have, whatever it is, it's not fake. It started as a contract. I'm not pretending it didn't, but that's not what it is now, and both of us know that, and I'm not going to sit in front of a lawyer and pretend otherwise just because the beginning was complicated." She looked at him for a long time. The composure was intact, but there was something behind it that was very close to the surface. "Okay," she said, finally, quietly. "Okay," he said. The deposition happened on Friday. Sandra conducted it in her office on Broad Street, same building where Petra Dalton worked, and both lawyers were present, and it was 2.5 hours of questions that moved from the clinical to the specific to the unexpectedly personal. Ethan answered everything directly. When did they first meet? March 14th, 7:15 in the morning, at the Rutledge Avenue job site. What was his first impression? That she was exhausted and serious and trying hard not to show either. When did his perception of her begin to change? He thought about it. The night she came to meet Lily, he said. The way she crouched down for the cat. The way she listened to Lily without the particular kind of patronizing attention adults usually gave children. Sandra asked, was there a moment he would describe as personally significant outside the professional context? He said, the magnolia tree, the backyard, a Saturday morning, the conversation about buildings and what they meant. She'd quoted her grandfather without knowing she was going to, and something in the way she said it had made him understand that the company she was fighting for wasn't about money or power or even legacy in the abstract. It was about a specific man she had loved and didn't want to lose again. Sandra wrote something down. Across the table, Vivian was looking at her own hands. She'd heard him say it, and she hadn't looked up, and he understood that meant something without being certain what. Vivian's deposition took 3 hours. He wasn't in the room for it. He sat in the hallway of the Broad Street office building on a wooden bench and answered emails on his phone and thought about the floor he was scheduled to finish on Tuesday and tried not to think about what was happening behind the closed door. When she came out, she looked wrung out. Not broken, but the kind of tired that was on the other side of having said real things out loud in front of people who were writing them down. How was it? He said. Thorough, she said. Then, Sandra thinks we're solid. Good. She sat down beside him on the wooden bench, which he hadn't expected. She sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and she looked at the far wall without saying anything, and he let the silence sit. You said the magnolia, she said, after a minute. Yeah. Why that one? He thought about it. Because you stopped performing for about 30 seconds. You said something real without deciding to say it. He looked at the wall, too. Most people, you can feel them deciding what to show you. With you, it's more work to get to the real thing, but once it's there, it's actually there. She was quiet. That's not a criticism, he said. I know. A pause. I spent a lot of years learning to keep things behind glass. It was useful. It still is, mostly. She turned her cup in her hands. She'd brought coffee from Sandra's office. Same habit anywhere. You don't do that. You just are what you are. I noticed that from the beginning. Must have been a novelty, he said dryly. She glanced at him. You have no idea, she said, with a dryness of her own that matched his exactly, and he was surprised into a short laugh that came out before he'd decided to let it. She looked at him when he laughed, and for a moment her expression was completely open, surprised and warm and unmanaged. and it lasted maybe 3 seconds before she gathered it back. But he'd seen it. He drove her home. Lily was with his neighbor Donna for the afternoon, and the house was quiet when they got back, and Vivian went upstairs to change, and Ethan went to the kitchen and started making dinner without thinking much about it. She came down 20 minutes later in the worn sweater she wore on evenings when she was done performing for the day. He'd come to recognize it as a signal, the difference between Vivian and Vivian at home, and the fact that he had a category in his head called Vivian at home was something he was aware of without dwelling on. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him cook. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." She came in and sat at the table. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked over his shoulder at her. "The assistant," she said. "Her name is Claire. I spoke to her this morning, before the deposition." She looked at the table. "She didn't deny it. She didn't admit it either, but she didn't deny it, and I've known her long enough to read the difference." She paused. "She's been offered a position with Declan's firm. Significant salary increase. I think she made a choice." "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it because he knew what that felt like. "She was good at her job," Vivian said. I thought she was someone who understood what we were trying to do." She stopped. "It's strange, isn't it? You can know someone professionally for years and still not really know what they'll do when the choice is expensive." "Yeah," he said. "I know." She looked at him, and he knew she remembered the detail about the former business partner because Vivian remembered everything she'd researched and everything he'd told her. It was one of the things about her that was occasionally unnerving and mostly just striking. The quality of her attention, the way nothing slipped past it. "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "about what you said at the deposition, about what you noticed." She seemed to be choosing the words carefully, the way she did when she was saying something she wasn't sure she should be saying. "I'm not used to being noticed that way. Not the surface, the part underneath." He turned the burner down. He turned around and looked at her. "You're not hard to notice," he said, "if you're actually paying attention." The kitchen was quiet. The evening light through the window was the particular gold of a late spring Charleston evening, and it caught the side of her face, and she looked like someone who was deciding carefully and with full awareness of the cost, whether to let something be true. Before either of them could say anything else, the front door opened and Lily came in from Donna's, calling for her dad before she'd gotten her shoes off. And the moment broke the way moments did in a house with a 7-year-old, cleanly and completely and without malice. "Dad, Donna's dog had puppies, 5 of them. Can we get one?" "No," Ethan said, automatically, turning back to the stove. "Vivian!" Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her jacket. "Donna's dog had puppies. Do you think we should get one?" Vivian looked at Ethan's back. He could feel her looking without seeing it. "I think your dad makes the pet decisions," she said. "But if you were deciding, Lily, I'm just asking." "One cat is enough," Ethan said. "Pancake would probably like a friend. Pancake would have a psychological event." Lily considered this with visible skepticism, then apparently decided to regroup. She disappeared toward her room, already talking about the puppies to herself, and the kitchen was ordinary again. Just 2 adults and a stove and a conversation that had gone somewhere real and then been interrupted by the specific grace of a child who didn't know she was interrupting anything. Vivian picked up her coffee. She looked at the doorway Lily had gone through, and the expression on her face was the one he'd seen at the gala when Ruth Gaines walked away. Open and slightly undone and quickly gathered. "She's extraordinary," Vivian said quietly. "She has her moments," Ethan said. "Because saying I know, she's the best thing I have felt like too much for a Tuesday kitchen." But Vivian looked at the side of his face, and he had the feeling she'd heard it anyway. The special board session was on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the fraud filing. Sandra had spent the intervening time building their record, and Declan's attorney had spent it trying to punch holes in it. And by the time they walked into the Ashcroft Heritage Conference Room again, it felt less like a business meeting and more like the last stage of something that had been fought for a long time. Declan was already seated. He looked at Ethan the way he'd looked at him the first time, measuring, recalculating, committing to nothing in his expression. Ethan looked back at him without particular feeling. He'd met men like Declan before, men who understood the value of things only in what they could be sold for, who looked at a 170-year-old building and saw a parcel, who looked at a woman carrying her grandfather's legacy and saw an obstacle. He didn't hate him, he just understood him, which was worse. Vivian presented the deposition record. Sandra walked the board through the timeline. The unnamed witness, who turned out to be Claire, as Vivian had expected, had provided a written statement claiming she'd overheard Ethan and Vivian discussing a financial arrangement, which was accurate, and had characterized it as the primary basis for the marriage, which was what Sandra spent 45 minutes dismantling with the detail and specificity of 2 depositions, a dozen witnessed public appearances, a letter from Ruth Gaines that the woman had written voluntarily without being asked, and the particular testimony of Marcus Webb, who had stood in front of the board and said, in the plain-spoken way of a man who had nothing to sell anyone, that he'd been watching Ethan Ryder for 12 years and could tell the difference between a man going through the motions and a man who meant something. The board voted 7-2 to dismiss the fraud challenge. Declan gathered his papers without expression. He stood. He looked at Vivian across the table, and something passed through his face. Not concession exactly, but the acknowledgement of a man who had lost this round and was already thinking about the next one. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Vivian said simply. He left. The room let out a collective breath that nobody had been admitting to holding. Board members who had been carefully neutral for weeks were suddenly more forthcoming. Handshakes, a few quiet words, the specific thaw of people who'd been waiting to see which way things went and had now seen. Ethan stood beside Vivian while she received these people, and he was aware of the shape of the evening, the particular quality of what they'd just been through together, and of the fact that in 3 more months, by the terms of a contract he'd signed on a kitchen table, this would be over. He was aware of not wanting it to be over. He was aware of that feeling carefully, the way he was careful about foundations. Outside the building, on the Meeting Street sidewalk in the early evening, Vivian stood next to him and looked at nothing specific and said, "Thank you," the way she'd said it after the first board meeting, simply without decoration. "Stop thanking me," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it makes it sound like a transaction." She held his gaze. The city moved around them, cars, people, the low golden light of a late afternoon in a city that was very old and had survived a great many things. Her face was tired and real and utterly unperformed. "What does it sound like if I don't?" she said. He didn't answer that. He started walking toward where he'd parked, 4 blocks away, because nobody had given him the garage code and they'd never gotten around to fixing that. And after a moment, she fell into step beside him. 4 blocks wasn't very far, but it was enough. The months after the special session had a different quality than the months before it. Before, everything had been pointed forward, toward the next threat, the next board meeting, the next thing Declan might try. The arrangement had existed in the conditional tense always until something, until the fraud challenge was dismissed, until the credibility period was established, until the contract term expired. There had been a comfort in that forward-pointed urgency, Ethan understood in retrospect, because it meant you didn't have to look too closely at what was accumulating in the present tense. Now the urgency had quieted, and the present tense was all there was, and it was full of things he hadn't entirely accounted for. Vivian was still in the house. By the terms of the agreement, she would be for another 3 months. They had not discussed this. They had not discussed much of what the evening on Meeting Street had approached, both of them stepping back from the edge of it with the particular caution of people who understood what was at stake and weren't ready to say so. They went on living in the way they'd developed. Her early mornings at the kitchen table, his early departures to job sites, Lily as the steady current that ran through the middle of everything and made it feel, despite its strangeness, like a household. What changed was the small things. She started cooking on Tuesdays. Not every Tuesday. It wasn't a declared thing. There was no conversation about it. But he'd come home on the second Tuesday after the board session to find her at the stove with Lily perched on the counter beside her, both of them looking at something on Lily's tablet, apparently in the middle of a debate about whether the recipe they were using required 1 tablespoon of something or 2. He'd stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed him, Watching his daughter explain her reasoning to a woman who ran a $400 million company with the same focused seriousness she applied to everything, and Vivian listening to it, actually revising her position, and he'd felt something shift in his chest that he chose not to examine closely. The food was not perfect. The first time she cooked, the chicken was slightly dry, and she noticed it before he did, and said so plainly, without apology. The way she acknowledged most things that didn't go right. The second time was better. The third time, Lily declared it the best thing she'd ever eaten, which was the kind of statement Lily made occasionally about food and could not be relied upon as objective assessment, but Vivian had smiled at it, a full smile, not the small controlled near smile he'd gotten used to, and that was its own kind of data. Marcus came to the house for dinner on a Saturday in June with his wife Keisha and their daughter Maya, who was 9 and had decided Lily was her best friend on the basis of 30 minutes of shared conversation about horses, which neither of them owned or had much contact with, but which they both apparently considered deeply important. Marcus had sat at Ethan's dinner table and watched Vivian help Lily refill water glasses and talk to Ethan about the new project they'd been awarded. A church hall in Somerville, pre-Civil War construction, significant structural work needed, and at one point had looked at Ethan with an expression that communicated, without a single word, everything Marcus had been too respectful to say for months. Ethan had looked back at him and communicated, equally without words, "I know, leave it alone." Marcus had smiled into his water glass and left it alone. That was why they were friends. In early July, Vivian took him to Beaufort. She had business there. A meeting with the site manager of the 2 Riverside properties, a review of the conservation easement status now that it had survived Declan's first challenge. She asked him the night before, casually, standing at the kitchen counter going through her email, whether he wanted to come. She framed it as practical. He knew restoration work. The site manager had questions about long-term structural assessment. His input would be useful. He said yes without pretending to think about it for very long, and she glanced at him briefly and went back to her email and said nothing more about it, which was how they both handled most things they weren't naming. They drove down on a Thursday morning, leaving before 7, Lily already at school. The drive was an hour and 40 minutes, and they spent most of it talking about the Somerville Church Hall. He'd described the structural challenges, and she'd asked better questions than most clients did, sharp specific questions about timber framing and foundation sequencing that revealed how much she'd actually absorbed in 5 months of living with a restoration contractor. And then for a while they didn't talk about anything, and the silence was the kind that had stopped requiring management somewhere around the 2nd month. Beaufort in July was green and heavy and unhurried in the way of a place that understood it was beautiful and wasn't going to perform about it. They drove down Bay Street with the water on one side and the old houses on the other, and Ethan looked at the architecture the way he always looked at it, assessing, appreciating, seeing the decisions behind the surfaces. And Vivian drove and didn't point things out, letting him look. The 2 properties were on a stretch of river south of town. They'd been maintained, he could see that, the kind of ongoing maintenance that was expensive and invisible and represented a genuine commitment. The structural bones of the 1847 building were better than he'd expected. The 1858 one had some foundation concerns that were real but not catastrophic. He walked through both buildings with the site manager, a careful 60-year-old named Peter who had been maintaining Ashcroft Heritage Properties for 18 years, and who shook Ethan's hand with the particular warmth of a man who had been given good help and recognized it as such. Vivian walked with them, but mostly listened, asking occasional questions, letting Ethan and Peter do the structural discussion. In the second building, the 1858 one, she went ahead of them into the main room and stood there while they were still in the hall. And when Ethan came through the doorway, he found her in the middle of the empty room, looking up at the ceiling, at the plasterwork, which was largely intact, with a particular quality of hand-done work that no modern reproduction achieved. "He was here," she said, quietly, to no one specific, "every summer when I was a kid. I used to sit on the porch outside while he walked through these rooms." She didn't look away from the ceiling. "He'd come out and tell me what he'd found, like he was reporting, like I was a colleague." A pause. "I was 10 years old." Ethan stood in the doorway and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and the moment didn't need him to fill it. "He died thinking they were safe," she said. He filed the easement application himself, 6 weeks before he got sick. He thought it was going through. She finally looked down, looked at the walls. Declan contested it on a technicality and had it delayed, and by the time my grandfather found out, he was already... She stopped, straightened. He never knew the delay happened. I made sure of that. You protected him from it, Ethan said. Someone should have protected him. She turned around and her face was collected again, the working face, but her eyes were doing something else. He spent his whole life protecting things that couldn't protect themselves. Seemed like the least I could do. He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking at the same walls she was looking at, and he thought about what it meant to inherit something that someone had poured their life into. Not the money, not the prestige, but the actual work, the actual love behind it. He thought about his daughter and the way he felt when she came home from school and told him things she'd learned that day, the specific joy of watching someone become themselves. He thought about Caroline and what she would have made of this, all of it, the whole impossible situation, and he thought she probably would have laughed first and then said something incisive that he'd have needed 3 days to fully unpack. She would have liked you, he said, without entirely meaning to say it. Vivian turned to look at him. She knew who he meant without being told, the way she knew most things about him by now. Caroline? Yeah. He kept his eyes on the plasterwork. She had a thing about people who meant what they said. She didn't have a lot of patience for people who were performing, and you're a lot of things, but you don't perform. I perform constantly, Vivian said, not the same kind. He looked at her. You manage, which is different. You decide what to show people, but you don't pretend to be something you're not. There's a difference. She held his gaze and said nothing, and he understood she was doing the things she sometimes did, deciding whether to let something land or to move past it. He waited. I'm afraid, she said, finally. Of this. She didn't gesture, but he understood what this meant. Not in the way I was afraid of Declan. That kind of fear I know how to use. This is... She paused, searching. Harder to make useful. Yeah, he said. I know. You're afraid too. It wasn't a question. He didn't treat it like one. Yes. Of what specifically? He thought about it with the honesty it deserved. That I've been here before. Not this situation, but the feeling of someone becoming, he found the word with some difficulty, necessary, and then everything changing. He looked at the river through the window, visible at the end of a line of old oaks. I know how to lose things. I got good at it. I don't want to have to be good at it again. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, Peter was talking to someone on his phone, his voice carrying faintly from the other room. I don't know how to promise you that, she said. I can't promise you that. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? He looked at her. Nothing. I'm just telling you the truth. You did that at the deposition. Seemed fair to return it. Something in her expression broke slightly. Not fell apart, just broke open at one seam, enough that he could see something real inside. She looked at him for a long moment with that expression, and then she did something he hadn't anticipated. She reached out and put her hand on his arm. Not the managed touch from the gala, not the strategic brush of a public appearance, but a real touch, brief and deliberate, her fingers on his forearm for 5 seconds. Then she stepped back. We should find Peter, she said, in a slightly different voice. Yeah, he said. We should. They drove back to Charleston mostly in silence, but it was the heaviest silence they'd had, full of something that was sitting between them without resolution, the kind of thing that had been said and couldn't be unsaid, and hadn't yet been answered. Declan's final move came in August. It wasn't legal this time. It was something more patient and, in some ways, more damaging. He'd spent the months since the fraud challenge dismissed quietly cultivating a relationship with a financial reporter at a national business publication, a real reporter with real credentials, who had a genuine story angle on family business governance disputes. The article that appeared was not a gossip blog post. It was a thoroughly reported 1,400-word piece about contested succession in legacy companies, using Ashcroft Heritage as its central case study. It named Ethan. It described the marriage timeline accurately. It quoted Declan,
identified only as a family stakeholder with significant holdings, suggesting that the board's decision to dismiss the fraud challenge had been driven by personal loyalty rather than legal clarity.
It was fair journalism, in the way that fair journalism could still be weaponized by someone with enough access to shape the sourcing. Vivian read it at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning. Ethan came down and saw her face before he saw what she was looking at, and he poured his coffee and sat across from her and waited. She turned the laptop so he could read it. He read it, all of it. Then he sat back. "How bad?" he said. "2 board members have already emailed me. Neutral language, but the subtext is that they want reassurance." She closed the laptop. "There's a shareholder meeting in September. Annual, required, non-optional. I have to stand in front of everyone who holds a piece of this company and make the case that the governance is sound and the marriage is real and the leadership is stable." "What do you need?" She looked at him. She'd been looking at him differently since Beaufort, or maybe he'd been seeing it differently since Beaufort, with less management between them, more of the actual thing underneath. "I need you to come. Stand beside me. Let them see us." "Okay." "It's not a small ask, it's Vivian." He waited until she stopped. "I know what it is." I said okay. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. Then she picked up her coffee and stood up, and he thought she was going to the office, but instead she went to the back door and opened it, and she stood there looking out at the backyard and the magnolia, and she said without turning around, "The contract expires in October." He said nothing. "Sandra reminded me last week. I should have told you sooner." She kept looking at the yard. "You've done everything you agreed to do, more than you agreed to do. Whatever happens in September, you've earned the exit." He looked at her back, at the particular set of her shoulders that was different from the boardroom set, softer, more real, the way she stood when she wasn't performing. He looked at the gray of her, the early morning light on her, and he thought about what he'd said in Beaufort and what she'd said back in the 5 seconds her hand had been on his arm. "What if I don't want the exit?" he said. She turned around. She looked at him across the kitchen, across the table where they'd had 100 conversations, across the house where she'd spent 5 months becoming something he hadn't planned for. And her face was completely open, which for Vivian was the most vulnerable thing she had. "Then we'd need to talk about that," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We would." She stood there, and he sat there, and neither of them moved, and Pancake walked in from the hallway and stepped directly on Ethan's foot, which broke the moment in the specifically undramatic way that cats broke things. And Ethan looked down at the cat, and Vivian made a sound that was the full laugh, the real one, the one that got out. And the kitchen was ordinary and impossible at the same time. The night before the shareholder meeting, Lily couldn't sleep. Ethan found her at 10 o'clock, sitting at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, which was where she went when she couldn't sleep, and didn't want to wake him, but didn't want to be alone either. He sat beside her on the top step, which was a thing they'd done since she was 4, and they looked down at the hallway below in companionable quiet. "Is Vivian going to leave?" Lily said. He looked at his daughter. She was looking at the hallway with the deliberate calm of someone who had been thinking about something for a while. "What makes you ask?" "She talks on the phone sometimes about things ending. I wasn't trying to listen." "I know you weren't." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet. It's complicated." "Because of the agreement thing?" He looked at her. "How do you know about an agreement?" Lily gave him a look that was older than 7. "Dad, I know things." He sighed. "Yeah, because of that, and because it's complicated between adults sometimes." "Do you want her to stay?" He thought about how much truth a 7-year-old could hold. He thought about what Lily had already held in her short life. Her mother gone before she'd had language for it. Years of just the 2 of them. The particular toughness and openness she'd developed out of necessity. He thought that she could hold quite a lot. "Yeah," he said, "I do." Lily nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already worked out. "She wants to stay too," she said. "What makes you say that?" "Because she fixed my book," Lily said, "the one with the broken spine. I didn't ask her to. I just left it on the table and she just fixed it." She looked at her feet on the step. "She didn't say anything about it?" She just did it. He sat with that. A book with a broken spine, quietly repaired, put back in its place without announcement. He thought about all the things Vivian did in this house without announcement. The dishes, the cat, the Tuesday cooking that had never been negotiated, the way she'd learned which shelf Lily's things went on and put them there without being asked. "Get some sleep," he said. "Are you going to talk to her?" "Eventually." "That means not tonight." "Probably not tonight." Lily stood up from the step with the gravity of someone who had said what she came to say. "Don't wait too long," she said, with a certainty that would have been funny if it hadn't been so direct, and went back to her room. He sat at the top of the stairs for a while after she'd gone. The house was quiet around him. Vivian's door closed, pancakes somewhere downstairs. The old wood settling the way old wood settled in the night. He thought about Caroline, and he thought about Lily's book. And he thought about buildings that survived because someone cared enough to maintain them. And he thought about the difference between a structure that was holding and a structure that was genuinely sound. The shareholder meeting was in the Ashcroft Heritage Building's 4th floor boardroom, but the full attendance meant they'd opened the connecting wall into the 5th floor event space, and there were 40 people there when Ethan and Vivian walked in together. 40 was more than he'd expected. Investors, Heritage Society representatives, a few journalists in the back, the board members arranged near the front. Declan was there. He was always there. Vivian presented for 45 minutes. Ethan sat in the front row and watched her, and understood, maybe for the first time with complete clarity, what she actually was. Not just a woman who'd been handed a company, not just someone defending an inheritance, but a person who had spent her entire adult life becoming capable of standing in a room like this and making people believe in something worth believing in. She knew the properties by name and by history. She knew the financials the way he knew timber grades, not just the numbers, but what they meant, what they indicated about the health of the whole. She talked about her grandfather without sentiment, but with the specific weight of someone who carried him. She was extraordinary. He'd known that in pieces. Sitting in that room, he knew it whole. When she finished, there were questions, pointed ones, skeptical ones, the kind that Declan had probably seeded through back channels. She answered each one without defensiveness, with the directness he'd recognized on a job site 5 months ago, and that still worked the same way it had that first morning. It made you believe her because it had nothing to perform. At the end, an older shareholder near the back, a woman Ethan didn't know, raised her hand and asked simply whether the marriage had affected the leadership. The room went very still. Vivian was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at Ethan in the front row, and he looked back at her, and whatever she saw in his face was apparently what she needed, because she turned back to the room and said, "Yes, it changed my understanding of what I was doing and why. My husband builds things meant to last. He spends his working life determining what's worth saving and making it possible to save it. I've been doing the same work for years. I just didn't understand them as the same thing until recently." A pause. He reminded me that preservation isn't a business strategy. It's a commitment. You don't preserve things because it's profitable or because it satisfies a governance requirement. You preserve them because they're worth preserving. She paused again, and her voice was level, but underneath it was something that wasn't managed at all. That clarity has made me a better leader, so yes. It affected the leadership, I think for the better. The room was quiet. Not the uncertain quiet of before, but the different kind. The kind after something real has been said. Declan, in a seat near the side wall, was looking at his hands. The meeting ended an hour later with no formal challenges called. The board members who'd emailed her that morning came up to her afterward, one by one, and the conversations were different from the cautious transactions of the previous months. Warmer, more direct, the specific warmth of people who had been shown something true and recognized it. Ethan stood off to the side and watched her work the room and thought about the fact that in 6 weeks, by contract, this was scheduled to be over. He thought about what he'd said at the top of the stairs to his daughter. He thought about a book with a broken spine, quietly repaired and put back in its place. Vivian found him 20 minutes later, when the room had mostly cleared. She stood in front of him with her jacket still on and her hair still perfect from the morning, and her face showing the particular exhaustion of someone who had given everything they had to something and had it work. What you said, he started. I meant it, she said before he could finish. All of it. I wasn't. She shook her head slightly. I wasn't performing. I want you to know that. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. Ethan, I know, he said again more quietly. I've known for a while. She looked at him. The composure was intact, but her eyes were doing what they did sometimes, saying the thing the rest of her face was too disciplined to say. He held her gaze and let her see whatever he had, which he'd always been bad at hiding and had mostly stopped trying to. They were standing in the room where it had all started, and in 6 weeks the contract said it was supposed to end, and neither of them moved toward or away from each other because some things had to be arrived at properly, with the right preparation, by people who understood that foundations mattered. But they were getting there. He could feel it the way he felt the bones of a building. Not with certainty yet, but with the specific confidence of someone who had learned to read what was underneath. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the Ashcroft Heritage Building together, 4 floors down and through the lobby and out onto Meeting Street, where Charleston was doing what it always did, going about its old particular business under a late August sky. And neither of them said what was coming next. They didn't need to. Not yet. The October morning when the contract expired was unremarkable in every external way. It was a Tuesday. Ethan was up at 5:15 as always, the alarm doing what alarms did. The ceiling above him, the same ceiling it had always been. He lay there for a moment in the particular dark of early fall, when the light hadn't decided to come in yet, and the house was still fully quiet, and he thought about the date with the same deliberateness he gave to things he'd been thinking about for weeks without quite landing on. October 14th. 12 months from the morning in the courthouse where a judge who smelled like coffee had read abbreviated vows with the efficiency of a man with a full docket. 12 months from the document Sandra had slid across a conference room table and 7 board members had looked at with varying degrees of surprise. 12 months from the moment that had seemed, at the time, like the most transactional possible beginning to something. He got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard magnolia, which had gone partly yellow with the season, the leaves giving up their color with the particular dignity of old things that understood change was part of surviving. Vivian came downstairs at 5:50. He heard her before he saw her. The specific sound of her on the stairs, which he'd learned the way you learned the sounds of a house you'd lived in long enough, as information rather than noise. She came into the kitchen in the worn sweater, the one that meant she was done performing for the day before the day had even started. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Coffee's ready," he said. "I know." She poured a cup. She stood at the counter instead of sitting at the table, which was unusual, and he understood she was feeling the date the same way he was. "Sandra called yesterday." "I know, she called me too." Vivian turned her cup in her hands. "She wanted to confirm the paperwork was ready, in case we wanted to file for the dissolution." "In case we wanted to," he said. "That's what she said." He turned from the window to look at her fully. She was looking at her coffee with the still expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something she hadn't finished thinking about, and her hair was loose the way it only was in the early mornings in the house, and she was, he thought, the most genuinely human-looking she ever was at this hour. No armor, no management, just a woman with her coffee and whatever was moving through her. "I don't want to file," he said. She looked up. "I told you that in August. Nothing's changed for me since August." He held her gaze. "But I need to know what you want, not what the company needs, not what the board situation requires. What you want." She was quiet for long enough that he felt the weight of it. Then she said, "I've been trying to answer that question cleanly for 2 months, and I keep arriving at the same place." "Which is?" "That I want to stay." She put her cup down on the counter. "Not because of the company, not because of the codicil or the board or any of the reasons we started this, because of—" She stopped, and he watched her do something he'd only seen her do a handful of times, search for a word and not find the polished version and say the real one instead. "Because of this, the house and Lily and the Tuesday cooking and the stupid cat who has apparently decided I belong here." A pause. "Because of you."
He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly. He'd been careful for months, not performing distance, not pretending he didn't feel what he felt, but careful, because he understood that this was the kind of thing you only did once the right way. And the right way required that both people were standing on the same ground voluntarily. They were standing on the same ground. He put his hand against her face, and she closed her eyes briefly, the way people did when something they'd been bracing against turned out to be gentle. And when she opened them again, she looked at him with the completely open expression that she'd never intended to develop for him and had anyway. The one that had no management left in it. No glass between her face and what she actually felt. He kissed her. She kissed him back, and it was nothing like the courthouse cheek brush 7 seconds of formality that had stood in for this moment 12 months ago. It was real and unhurried, and they were both slightly awkward about it in the honest way of two people who had wanted something for a long time and were finally allowing it, and when they stepped back from each other, they were both quiet for a moment. "Finally," said a voice from the doorway. They both turned. Lily was standing at the kitchen entrance in her pajamas, with the expression of a child who had been waiting for adults to catch up to something she'd worked out months ago. She was looking at them with a satisfaction that was trying very hard to be casual and completely failing. "How long have you been standing there?" Ethan said. "Long enough," Lily said. She walked to the refrigerator and opened it with the nonchalance of someone whose work was done. "We're out of orange juice." Ethan looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Ethan. Then she made the sound. The full laugh, the real one, the one that came from somewhere genuine and unguarded, and it filled the kitchen the way good things filled spaces, without announcing itself. "I'll get juice," he said. "Get dressed, Lily." "Already was dressed," Lily said, gesturing at her pajamas as if this were a contestable point, and disappeared back down the hall. He was still smiling when he reached for his keys, and Vivian was still laughing quietly behind him, and the kitchen was full of the kind of ordinary morning that turned out, in retrospect, to be the most important kind. They called Sandra that afternoon and told her not to file. Sandra said, "I had a feeling," and that was that. Ethan told Marcus that same week on the job site during a lunch break. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, that the contract had expired and they weren't dissolving the marriage, and that he wanted Marcus to know directly, rather than through the ambient communication that moved through small professional circles. Marcus sat on an overturned bucket and ate his sandwich and nodded slowly, and then he said, "Keisha's going to be smug about this." "Why?" "Because she called it in month 2. He looked at Ethan. "She said, and I quote, 'That man is gone for that woman, and he doesn't know it yet.'" Ethan didn't say anything. "She's usually right about these things," Marcus said, with the equanimity of a man who had made peace with this fact long ago. "Noted," Ethan said, and went back to work. He told Lily properly that evening. Not the version she'd already assembled from observation, but the adult version, the honest one. That the arrangement they'd started with had become something else, and he wanted her to understand it wasn't something that had happened to her, it was something that was going to include her, because everything that mattered to him included her. Lily listened to this with the careful attention she gave important things. And then she asked whether that meant Vivian was staying, and he said yes. And she asked whether they would have to move, and he said no. And she said, "Good, because I like this house." And then asked if she could watch television, which was perhaps not the emotional climax he'd been building toward, but was probably the right-sized response for a 7-year-old who had already been reading the situation clearly for months. What took longer and was harder and mattered more than any of the logistical conversations was the conversation between Ethan and Vivian on a Friday night in late October, when Lily was at a sleepover and the house was genuinely quiet in a way it rarely was, and they sat at the kitchen table with wine, which was not their usual coffee, was itself a small declaration of a different register, and talked without the pressure of an audience or an agenda. She told him about the years before her grandfather died, the particular loneliness of being competent and responsible and still not trusted simply because of the governance structure and the assumptions it encoded. She told him about the 2 relationships she'd had in her 30s that had both eventually collapsed under the weight of what her life required. Not bad men, she said carefully, just men who had wanted something simpler than what she was. And she hadn't blamed them, which she'd thought at the time was generosity,
but now thought might have been the avoidance of having to feel how much it cost her. She told him about the night her grandfather died in the hospital, the way she'd sat with him at the end and held his hand and thought about all the buildings still standing because of his decisions and whether that was enough of a legacy to justify a life, and had decided that it was the whole point, and that she was going to carry it forward if it cost her everything. He listened to all of it. He didn't rush her past the hard parts or offer comfort that would have softened the edges of what she was actually saying. He understood that she was giving him something she hadn't given many people, and that the right response to that was to receive it fully. Then he told her about Caroline. Not the version he'd told other people over the years, the abbreviated, careful version that disclosed the loss without exposing the rest of it, but the actual one. About meeting her at 24 at a housewarming party for someone he barely knew and arguing with her within the first 15 minutes about the relative merits of new construction versus restoration, and how the argument had turned into a 3-hour conversation on the back porch, and how he'd known somewhere during that conversation that he was in genuine trouble. About the years before Lily, the building of something, the specific happiness of a life made with someone who matched you. About the way it ended, the diagnosis, the 18 months, the things you said and didn't say when you understood that time was finite, the morning after. About Lily, who was 2, who asked for her mother for 3 months with the precision of a child who didn't yet have the language for what gone meant, and how he had answered that question 100 times and never once without cost. Vivian listened the same way he had, fully, without rushing him through it, without offering the comfortable words that would have made it easier and smaller at the same time. When he was done, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. She didn't say anything about it. She just left it there, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen, where they'd had so many conversations, and where the story between them had actually been written, page by page, in the ordinary accumulation of shared mornings and disagreements, and a child's questions and a cat's inexplicable loyalties. "I'm not her," Vivian said, finally, quietly. "I know you know that, but I want to say it. I know."
"And you're not the arrangement I planned." A pause. "You're better than what I planned. You're real in a way I didn't know I was missing until I had it." He looked at her hand in his. He looked at her face. He thought about 5 months of watching someone become necessary, and 6 months of knowing it, and 2 months of waiting for the right moment. And he thought that the right moment had turned out not to be a moment at all, but an accumulation. All the small things, all the Tuesday cooking and fixed books and pancake and the magnolia and the 1847 building on the Beaufort River and the deposition and the gala and the 4 blocks to the parking garage every single time, because nobody had ever given him the code. "I'm going to need the parking garage code," he said. She blinked. Then she understood, and something lit in her face. Not just the laugh, but something warmer and less surprised. The kind of warmth that had settled in because it had somewhere permanent to be. "I'll have Sandra email it to you," she said. "Tonight?" "Tonight," she said. "First thing." Declan made one more attempt in November. He filed with the trust administrator a request for a formal audit of the conservation easement on the Beaufort properties, citing procedural irregularities in the original application. It was a long shot, and everyone on both sides of it knew it was a long shot. His own lawyer had probably told him as much. But Ethan had learned enough about Declan Ashcroft over the preceding months to understand that he would keep finding long shots until there were none left. It was the nature of a man who had spent his whole life in proximity to power. He didn't hold. The reaching never really stopped. The audit request was reviewed and rejected by the trust administrator in 3 weeks. Clean paperwork, clean process, clean record. Thomas Ashcroft had done everything right on that application, down to the last page. Vivian called Ethan when Sandra gave her the news. He was at the Somerville Church Hall, standing inside the oldest section of the building where the timber framing was original, looking at joinery that someone had cut by hand 160 years ago and that was still doing its job. He picked up the call and she told him, and her voice had something in it that wasn't triumph, wasn't relief exactly, was more like completion, like the sound of a door being closed on something you'd been walking away from for a long time and hadn't been fully sure was behind you until now. "It's done?" he said.
The easement stands. Both properties are protected. He can't touch them through the trust, and he doesn't have the board votes to force a sale, and the easement means even if he ever acquired controlling interest, he couldn't demolish. She paused. They're safe. They're going to outlast all of us. He stood in the timber frame of the old church hall and thought about two buildings on a Beaufort River that had been standing since before his grandmother's grandmother was born and would be standing when Lily's grandchildren were old, and he felt the specific satisfaction of something preserved that deserved to be. Your grandfather would be glad, he said. A longer pause. Yeah, she said softly. He would. After he hung up, he stood in the old timber frame for a few more minutes. The joinery was extraordinary. Mortise and tenon, wood pinned to wood, the whole structure held by friction and fit and the simple physics of things made to work together. No adhesive, no metal fasteners, just the right shapes joined correctly, trusted to hold. He thought about that on the drive home. It was Marcus who first said the word that nobody in the house had said yet. He said it at the end of November, at the Somerville site, during a conversation about the spring schedule, when he mentioned in passing that Keisha wanted to know whether Vivian would be at the Webb family Christmas thing in December. And Ethan said he'd ask, and Marcus said, "She's going to be your wife for real at some point, right? Not just on paper." Ethan looked at him. "I'm not pushing," Marcus said. We want to know how to think about her, for the record. Keisha wants to know." "Tell Keisha to mind her business," Ethan said. "She will absolutely not do that," Marcus said. Ethan drove home that evening thinking about what Marcus had said. Not pushed, just said. The simple observation that the thing had moved from paper to real, and that there was a natural next step that real things had, and that the step was being waited on. He thought about Vivian. He thought about the particular way she'd started leaving her jacket on the hook by the door. Not hung up formally in the closet, just on the hook, which was Lily's hook, and his hook, and a thing you only did in a house where you belonged without question. He thought about how she'd taken Lily to school twice last week without being asked, because he'd had an early call with a new client and she'd just said, "I'll take her," in the casual way of someone for whom it was not a favor but a given. He thought about the way she talked about the company now, still with the same commitment, the same rigor, but with a different undertone, as if it had stopped being the only thing and had found its right proportion among other things that also mattered. He thought about Caroline the way he still sometimes did, not with grief anymore exactly, but with the particular gratitude of someone who understood that having loved well once made it possible to recognize what love actually looked like when it was in the room again. He didn't think Caroline would have had strong opinions about the situation except to find the beginning of it hilarious, and then, after watching it develop, to have absolutely no questions about how it turned out. He stopped at a jewelry store on the way home. Not a big one, not a flashy one. A small place on King Street that had been there since the 1940s and had cases full of things that looked like they'd been made by actual people rather than manufactured for a demographic. He looked for 20 minutes and found a ring that was simple and direct and good, which was the only kind of thing he'd ever been interested in. He drove the rest of the way home. Lily was doing homework. Vivian was on the phone in the backyard. He could see her through the kitchen window, pacing slowly along the fence, the way she did when calls required movement. He made dinner. He waited. She came inside at 7, and the homework was done, and Lily was watching television, and the kitchen smelled like garlic again, and Vivian went to hang her jacket on the hook by the door the way she did now, and Ethan turned the burner to low and turned around. "Vivian." She looked at him. Something in his voice or his face told her to pay full attention, and she did. The complete still attention she gave to things she'd decided mattered. He didn't get down on one knee. He thought about it and decided it wasn't the right register for them, for who they actually were to each other. He stood in his kitchen and held out the ring and said, "I'm not asking because of the contract or the company or the board. I'm asking because you fixed Lily's book, and you talked to Pancake before you talked to me on most mornings. And you know what heart pine looks like when it's original versus replaced, and because when I'm in a building that's been saved from being lost, I think about you." He paused. "I'm asking because you're the person I want to be accountable to. Not legally. Actually." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She had the open face, the completely unmanaged one, the one with nothing between her and what she felt. "You know the Parker Street property?" she said. He hadn't expected that. "The one that went to foreclosure last spring? I bought it last month, privately. It needs significant restoration work." She paused. "I need a contractor." He looked at her. "That's a yes?" she said. "I just wanted you to know the professional arrangement also continues." He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. And she was smiling when he put the ring on her finger, and from the living room Lily called, "Is that happening?" at a volume that suggested she'd been listening through the wall for some time, and Vivian called back yes without looking away from Ethan's face, and there was the sound of a 7-year-old expressing approval at a volume that was probably audible to the neighbors. They were married again in April, not because they had to be, because they wanted to, which was the entire difference. Vivian had said she didn't need a large wedding, and Ethan had said the same, and they had both meant it, and as a result, the wedding they ended up with was about 40 people in the backyard of the Craftsman bungalow on a Saturday morning in spring, with the magnolia in full bloom in the corner and folding chairs borrowed from Marcus's church, and a cake that Lily had been consulted on extensively, and that was accordingly lemon with lavender frosting, which was a combination that Ethan had his doubts about, but which turned out to be genuinely good. The judge who married them this time was different from the courthouse judge. A woman named Adeyeze Okafor, who had known Thomas Ashcroft for 30 years and who had agreed to officiate when Vivian asked her, with the dry observation that she was glad someone had finally talked some sense into the girl. She performed the ceremony with warmth and some humor and zero wasted words, which was exactly right. Ethan's crew was there. Marcus and Keisha in the front row, his guys from Rutledge Avenue and Somerville filling out the middle rows, men who worked with their hands and understood what it meant to build something worth keeping. Ruth Gaines was there because Vivian had asked her, and because Ruth had apparently been following the story with the proprietary interest of someone who felt she'd had a minor role in its early stages. Several of the board members came, the ones who'd come around, the ones for whom the September shareholder meeting had been clarifying. Declan was not there. Nobody had invited him, and nobody had expected him to come, and nobody mentioned him, which was about right. Lily was the flower girl, a role she had accepted on the condition that she could also give a short speech at the reception, which Ethan had agreed to without fully understanding what he was agreeing to. The speech turned out to be 3 minutes long and consisted primarily of Lily explaining that she had known Vivian was going to stay since approximately month 2 because of the way Vivian listened to people, which was not the same as how most adults listened, and that she was very glad about it, and also that the cake had been her idea. Several people cried. Marcus's daughter Maya, who was Lily's best friend and had been given a front row seat to the entire preceding year, applauded loudly and in the specific way of a 9-year-old who felt personally vindicated. Ethan held Vivian's hand through the ceremony and looked at her and thought about the morning on the job site a little over a year ago, the black car pulling up, a woman in heels crossing uneven ground toward him with a specific and impossible request. He thought about what he'd known then. Nothing, essentially, except that she was serious and exhausted, and that the thing she was asking him to help save was worth saving. And what he knew now, which was everything, the whole accumulating weight of a person known thoroughly, and the gap between those two states was so large that the first one barely felt like the same story. It was the same story. That was the point. You started somewhere with the information you had, and if you paid attention and didn't run from what was hard, you ended up somewhere that the beginning had made possible without ever making inevitable. Nothing about this had been inevitable. That was what made it actual. He kissed her at the end of the ceremony. A real kiss this time, not the courthouse formality, and Lily said finally again in exactly the same tone she'd used in the kitchen 12 months before, and the backyard laughed, and the magnolia was in bloom, and the day was warm and imperfect in all the specific ways that made it real. A year after the wedding, Ryder Restoration completed the Parker Street project. It was a 19th century commercial building in the Upper King Street corridor that had been through 6 different owners and 3 bad renovations, and a partial fire, and had come out the other side structurally compromised but fundamentally intact, which was the story of a lot of things that had been through enough and survived. Ethan's crew spent 8 months on it, longer than he'd estimated because the foundation work was more complicated than the initial assessment suggested, and he'd made the call to do it right rather than fast, which was the only call he ever made and which was why people kept hiring him. The building had 4 retail spaces on the ground floor and 6 apartment units above. And when they finished, it looked like what it actually was, something old that had been brought back to itself, with all its history intact and its structure sound and its new life beginning. The opening was attended by the Preservation Society and the Historic District Commission and a reporter from the Post and Courier who wrote a piece about it that used the word exemplary in the headline, which Marcus read aloud on the job site the next morning in a voice that was more theatrical than was strictly necessary. Vivian came to the opening with Lily, who was 8 now and had developed a genuine interest in old buildings that Ethan suspected was partly authentic and partly a form of solidarity with her father that had somewhere along the way become its own actual thing. Lily walked through the finished space and asked Marcus specific questions about the foundation work that were better than the reporter's questions, and Marcus answered them with the seriousness they deserved. And Ethan watched his daughter and his foreman talking construction across a finished heart pine floor, and felt something that had no clean name, but that lived in the chest somewhere near the place where the things you couldn't lose were kept. The Beaufort properties were open to the public that same fall. The 1847 building was now a small museum, not a large or elaborate one, just a careful one, with exhibits that told the actual history of the place without simplification or avoidance. The 1858 building was used for events and Preservation Society gatherings, and the riverfront porch was available for a modest rental fee that covered the ongoing maintenance costs. Thomas Ashcroft had wanted them to be living buildings, his site manager Peter had said once, not frozen, not museumified in the pejorative sense, but genuinely inhabited, genuinely part of what the present was building on top of the past. Vivian brought Ethan back there in October, 2 years to the month from the kitchen conversation that had changed the direction of things. They stood on the porch of the 1847 building in the early evening light and looked at the river, which was doing what the Beaufort River always did, moving slowly and carrying everything with it. And she leaned against him in the uncalculated way she'd developed somewhere in the middle of the first year, the way of a person who had stopped calculating where leaning was allowed. He would be here, if he could be, she said. Not with sadness exactly, but with the specific weight of someone carrying someone else's absence and finding it mostly bearable. The building is here, Ethan said. Same thing, kind of? She was quiet for a moment. Yeah, she said. Kind of. He put his arm around her, and they stayed on the porch while the light changed, and the river moved, and the building held. Hot. Here is what Ethan Ryder learned in the year that a stranger got out of a black car and walked across his job site with an impossible request. That the bones of a thing matter more than the surface. That most structures, if you look carefully enough, are not as broken as they appear. They have been covered over, built around, neglected, occasionally actively damaged, but the original material is often still there, still sound, still worth the work of returning it to itself. That people are like this too. He already knew it, more or less, but he knew it more completely after. He learned that the beginning of something is not its character. He had started in a courthouse with a woman he had met 24 hours before, surrounded by paperwork and strategy and the clinical language of legal protection, and that beginning was real. He didn't revise it, didn't pretend it was something warmer in retrospect, but it was not what the thing became, and what the thing became was not undermined by how it started. A restored building is not less itself because it was in disrepair once. A marriage is not less real because it began with a contract. What matters is not the first day, but the accumulation, the daily choosing, the small decisions, the Tuesday cooking and the fixed books, and the mornings at the kitchen table, and the 4 blocks to the parking garage, and the moment when you understand that what began as a practical arrangement has become the architecture of your actual life. He learned about the particular courage of a woman who had carried something enormous for years and had not put it down, not once, and who had had the harder kind of courage too, the kind required to let someone in after years of managing everyone out, to let the glass down, to accept that being known was not the same as being vulnerable in the bad way. He learned, or rather remembered with more clarity than he'd had before, that grief does not disqualify you. He had loved Caroline completely and had lost her and had been remade by the losing and had, for years, treated the remaking as the permanent condition, as what he was now, what he would remain. He understood now that it was not the permanent condition, that the remaking was a passage, not a destination, that the capacity to love completely once was evidence of the capacity to do it again, not a contract with the past that forbade it.
Lily learned in her 8-year-old's language that families were made in many different ways and that the making was the important part, and that a family with a worn sofa and a neurotic cat and a woman who fixed broken books and a man who knew how to look at old things and see what they used to be was as real as any other kind, and probably better than most. Vivian learned that the things she had been protecting all those years, her grandfather's legacy, the buildings, the commitment to preservation, was not in conflict with having a life. She had believed, somewhere in her disciplined bones, that it required her full self, that to divide attention was to betray the mission. She learned that this was wrong, and that the man who had walked through the Battery Inn and felt its craftsmanship in his chest and said nothing about it because the feeling didn't need an audience was the proof that it was wrong.
That people who understood what was worth keeping were the same people who could build something new worth keeping. That the commitment did not have to be solitary to be real. Ashcroft Heritage, in the years that followed, became something its founder had always hoped it might be. A company that was genuinely of the city it had grown from, connected to the people who actually worked in its buildings, who lived near them, who knew their histories. Ethan's company became a primary restoration partner, which was an arrangement that had a formal professional structure and also the informal structure of two people who spent their evenings at the same kitchen table and who had, over years, developed the capacity to disagree loudly about restoration methods and then be fine about it over dinner, which is the specific competence that makes a professional partnership actually functional. Marcus got a parking garage code in the 3rd year. He said nothing about it. Ethan said nothing about it either. They were men who communicated important things without speeches, and the code was enough. Declan Ashcroft, who had never been a villain in the operatic sense, just a man shaped by proximity and want and the specific bitterness of someone who had grown up next to something great and had never been asked to be its custodian, eventually divested his 31% stake and moved on to other things. Vivian felt, when Sandra told her, less triumph than she'd expected. Mostly she felt the particular stillness of a fight finally over. She did not wish him badly. She simply wished him elsewhere, which is what she'd wished from the beginning. The magnolia in the backyard of the Craftsman bungalow had a good spring that 3rd year, fuller than it had been in years, which the internet told Lily was because the winter had been exactly cold enough for long enough, which magnolias apparently needed. Lily informed Ethan of this at breakfast with the specific enthusiasm of a child who had discovered that things people thought were random turned out to have reasons. Vivian looked at the tree through the window and said, "Your grandfather would have said that was the whole point." And when Lily asked what she meant, she said that things need the hard season. It's how they bloom. Lily considered this with her particular 7, 8, 9-year-old gravity and said, "That's kind of sad, though." "A little," Vivian said, "and kind of not." The tree was in full bloom by April. By then they were used to it, the way you got used to beautiful things that were reliable, so not bored, just settled. The specific comfort of knowing a thing was there and would be there again next year and the year after that. That was what they had built. Not perfect. Not without its difficulties, its disagreements, its moments of being two imperfect people sharing a small house and a complicated life, and the ongoing negotiation that entailed. But sound. The foundations checked. The bones good. The kind of structure that, if you were a man who knew how to look at buildings, you'd call worth saving, worth the work, worth everything it had taken to get here. Ethan Ryder had agreed to help a stranger save 2 buildings on a river in Beaufort, and had ended up understanding in ways he hadn't anticipated what it meant to preserve something, not the method, but the meaning. Why it mattered that certain things endured, that certain commitments outlasted the circumstances that created them, that the best structures were the ones built to hold more than their original purpose required. He had signed a contract on a kitchen table, and it had become a life. He thought about that sometimes, standing on a job site somewhere, or driving the familiar streets of a city he had always loved and now loved differently, or sitting at the table on a Saturday morning with coffee and his wife beside him, and his daughter's voice from upstairs, and the cat asleep on the floor in a square of October sun. He thought, this is what survived. Not despite how it started, because of everything that came after. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. The buildings stand, the people endure. The things built with genuine intention outlast the circumstances that made them necessary. And sometimes, not always, not without cost, not without the work of 10,000 ordinary mornings, the thing you agreed to becomes the thing you chose. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.